The morning light caught the diamond like a trapped star, casting rainbows across the mahogany table where Sarah Chen sat frozen, her world tilting on its axis. Across from her, Margaret Whitmore's manicured fingers drummed against her designer handbag, the sound sharp as gunshots in the suffocating silence of the downtown law office. "I'm not asking, Sarah, I'm telling you." Margaret's voice carried that particular brand of authority that came from 30 years of country club boards and charity galas. "Jessica is getting married in 6 weeks. She needs that ring more than you do now." The engagement ring, her engagement ring, sat between them like an accusation. 2 carats of flawless brilliance set in platinum, surrounded by a delicate halo of smaller diamonds that caught every tremor of Sarah's shaking hand. It had been David's grandmother's ring, passed down through 3 generations of Whitmore women, each adding their own story to its legacy of love and commitment. Sarah's throat felt like sandpaper. "Margaret, I understand Jessica is your daughter, but David gave this to me when he proposed. We were supposed to be married in 2 months." "We're supposed to be." Margaret's emphasis cut like a blade. "But David is gone, isn't he? And Jessica is very much alive and in need of a family heirloom for her wedding to Thomas Ashworth." "The Ashworths, Sarah. Do you understand what that means for our family's standing?" The law office smelled of old leather and desperate decisions. Robert Chen, Sarah's uncle, and the only lawyer she could afford on her teacher's salary, adjusted his glasses with the careful precision of a man trying to defuse a bomb. He'd been practicing family law for 23 years, but the tension in this room felt different, more personal, more cruel. "Mrs. Whitmore," Robert began carefully, "the ring was a gift between engaged parties. Legally, Sarah has every right to—" "Legally," Margaret interrupted, her perfectly shaped eyebrows arching with disdain, "Sarah has no legal standing in this family anymore. The ring belongs to the Whitmore family. It should go to the Whitmore daughter who is actually capable of getting married." The words hit Sarah like physical blows. 6 months had passed since the car accident that took David away from her. 6 months of existing in a gray world where colors seemed muted and food tasted like ash. She'd worn the ring every day, a tangible connection to the future they'd planned together, the house they'd picked out in Maple Heights, the children they dreamed of naming, the garden David had promised to help her plant. "You don't understand," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible over the hum of the air conditioning. "This ring, it's all I have left of him." Margaret leaned forward, her Chanel perfume mixing with the office's stale air. "What I understand is that my son is dead and nothing will bring him back, but my living daughter has a chance at happiness, and I won't let your grief stand in the way of that." The cruelty of it stole Sarah's breath. She thought of Jessica, David's younger sister, who had always looked at Sarah with barely concealed resentment. At 24, Jessica was everything Margaret had hoped for in a daughter. Blonde where Sarah was brunette, willowy where Sarah was curvy, effortless where Sarah had to work for everything she achieved. Jessica had never worked a day in her life, moving from private school to sorority house to her parents' guest wing while waiting for the right man to marry. "David chose me," Sarah said, surprised by the strength in her own voice. "He chose me and this ring. Don't you think that means something?" Margaret's laugh was bitter as winter wind. "David chose poorly, clearly. If he'd chosen better, perhaps he'd still be alive." The implication hung in the air like smoke. Sarah had been driving that night, coming home from her school's spring fundraiser. David had stayed late at his architectural firm working on the community center project that had consumed him for months. If Sarah had picked him up instead of meeting him at home, if she'd taken the highway instead of the back roads, if she'd left the fundraiser 5 minutes earlier. "That's enough," Robert said sharply. "Mrs. Whitmore, I understand you're grieving, but blaming my niece for your son's death is inappropriate and cruel." Margaret's mask slipped for just a moment, revealing the raw pain underneath. "My son is dead. My family's legacy dies with him unless Jessica carries it forward. That ring has been in our family for 60 years. It belongs with a Whitmore bride." Sarah stared at the ring, remembering the night David proposed. They'd been at Riverside Park, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of pink and gold. David had been nervous, stumbling over words he'd probably rehearsed 100 times. When he dropped to one knee, producing his grandmother's ring from his jacket pocket, Sarah had started crying before he could finish the question. "My grandmother wore this ring for 53 years, David had said, his voice thick with emotion. My mother wore it for 31. I want you to wear it for the rest of our lives." The ring had fit perfectly, as if it had been waiting for her finger all along. David had kissed her hand, sealing the promise between them, and Sarah had never imagined a day when she might have to give it back. "I need time to think," Sarah said finally. Margaret's expression hardened. "Jessica's engagement party is this Saturday. The announcement will be in the society pages. She needs the ring." "I said I need time." "Time is a luxury we don't have. Jessica has already told Thomas about the ring. The Ashworth family is expecting to see it." Robert cleared his throat. "Perhaps we should schedule another meeting?" "No." Margaret stood, her movements sharp and decisive. "I've been patient enough. Sarah, if you don't give me that ring by Friday, I'll have my lawyers explore every legal avenue to get it back. Do you understand me?" The threat was clear. Margaret Whitmore had resources that Sarah couldn't begin to match: expensive lawyers, social connections, and the kind of influence that could make a public school teacher's life very difficult. She thought of her students, her small apartment, her aging Toyota that barely made it through last winter. She couldn't afford a legal battle, couldn't afford to lose her job, couldn't afford to fight a war she was destined to lose. "I understand," Sarah said quietly. Margaret smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "I knew you would. You're a practical girl, Sarah. It's one of the few things David saw in you that I could appreciate." After Margaret left, the office felt empty and cold. Robert sank back in his chair, rubbing his temples with the deliberate motions of a man fighting off a headache. "I'm sorry, Sarah. I wish there was more I could do." "Is she right? Legally, I mean? Does the ring belong to the family?" Robert sighed. "It's complicated. Engagement rings typically remain with the recipient, regardless of how the engagement ends. But this ring has family history, and if they can prove it was a conditional gift, they'd win. They might. Margaret Whitmore has the resources to drag this out for years. The question is whether you can afford to fight." Sarah already knew the answer. She touched the ring with her thumb, feeling the familiar weight of it, the way the setting caught on her other fingers when she gestured while teaching. She thought of her students, 8th graders who looked up to her, who trusted her to be there every day, who needed stability in their chaotic teenage lives. She couldn't risk losing her job over a ring, no matter how much it meant to her. But as she sat in that sterile office, surrounded by law books and legal precedents, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Margaret's desperation felt off-key, like a song played in the wrong tempo. Why was she so insistent on this particular ring? Jessica could afford any engagement ring she wanted. The Whitmore family had money, connections, social standing. So why did they need David's grandmother's ring specifically? "Uncle Robert," Sarah said slowly, "would it be possible to get the ring appraised? I mean, officially appraised? By someone who knows about antique jewelry?" Robert looked up, interested despite himself. "What are you thinking?" "I don't know yet, but Margaret seemed desperate, and desperate people don't always tell the truth." Robert nodded thoughtfully. "I know someone, Elena Rodriguez, downtown. She's been appraising jewelry and antiques for 20 years. Very thorough, very honest." "How much would it cost?" "For a basic appraisal, maybe $200. "Are you thinking there's something special about the ring?" Sarah stared at the diamond, watching light dance through its facets. "David's grandmother lived through the Depression, didn't she? And his grandfather was— what did David say? Something about Europe? You think there might be more to the ring's history?" "I think Margaret knows something I don't. And I think I need to find out what it is before I hand over the only piece of David I have left." As Sarah left the law office, the ring felt heavier on her finger, weighted not just with precious metals and stones, but with secrets waiting to be uncovered. The afternoon sun caught the diamond and threw light across the sidewalk, creating patterns that shifted and changed with each step she took. She had until Friday to decide. 3 days to choose between the practical path Margaret had laid out for her and the uncertain journey toward truth that her instincts demanded.
3 days to decide whether David's memory was worth fighting for, even if the battle might cost her everything else she had left. Behind her, Robert Chen watched through his office window as his niece walked away, the engagement ring glinting on her finger like a tiny beacon in the growing dusk. He'd seen enough legal battles to know when someone was hiding something important, and Margaret Whitmore's performance today had all the hallmarks of a woman protecting a secret. The question was whether Sarah would have the courage to uncover it, and whether she'd survive what she found. Sarah's apartment on Pine Street had always been small, but in the months since David's death, it felt like a tomb. The one-bedroom space that had once seemed cozy and intimate now pressed against her from all sides, filled with memories that refused to fade. Every corner held pieces of their shared life: the bookshelf David had built from reclaimed wood, the throw pillows they'd picked out together at the farmer's market, the coffee mug with the chip on the handle that he insisted was character building. She moved through her evening routine like a sleepwalker, heating leftover Chinese takeout, while the ring caught fluorescent kitchen light and scattered it across her reflection in the microwave door. The diamond seemed to pulse with its own heartbeat, a reminder of promises made and futures stolen. Sarah had taken to talking to it sometimes, whispering David's name when the silence became too heavy to bear. Her phone buzzed against the counter. Another text from her mother in Portland, the third one this week. "Honey, maybe it's time to move home. Fresh start, you know? Your old room is still waiting." Sarah deleted the message without responding, just like she'd deleted the ones before it. Running away wouldn't bring David back, and it wouldn't silence the questions that had started eating at her since Margaret's ultimatum. The walls of her living room were covered with photos: their first vacation to the coast, David's graduation from architecture school, lazy Sunday mornings when they'd been too happy to get out of bed. In every picture, David wore the same expression of quiet contentment, as if he'd found exactly where he belonged in the world. Sarah used to see that same expression in her own face, but lately she barely recognized the hollow-eyed woman staring back from mirrors.
She settled onto the couch with her dinner, the same spot where she and David had spent countless evenings planning their future. He'd been obsessed with details, sketching floor plans for their dream house on napkins, researching school districts even though kids were still years away, creating spreadsheets for their 5-year financial plan. David had been a planner, someone who believed that careful preparation could prevent any disaster. The irony wasn't lost on her. "What would you do?" she asked the empty room, her voice echoing off walls that had heard the question 100 times before. "If you were here, what would you tell me about your mother and sister?" The silence that answered felt different tonight, charged with possibility rather than just emptiness. Sarah found herself studying the ring with new attention, turning her hand to catch the light at different angles. She'd worn it for 8 months before David died, and 6 months since, but she'd never really looked at it, not as an object separate from its emotional weight. The setting was more intricate than she'd initially noticed. Tiny engravings ran along the platinum band, so small they might have been decorative flourishes, but as Sarah squinted in the lamplight, they looked almost like letters or numbers. She'd need a magnifying glass to be sure, but the markings definitely seemed intentional. Her laptop sat open on the coffee table, cursor blinking in a half-finished email to her principal about next week's parent conferences. Instead of returning to work, Sarah found herself typing "antique engagement rings 1960s" into the search bar. Then Whitmore family history. Then European jewelry, Depression era. The results were frustratingly vague: genealogy sites that required paid subscriptions, auction records for generic vintage rings, historical articles about families she'd never heard of. But one result caught her attention: a newspaper clipping from 1962 archived in the Portland Historical Society's digital collection. The headline read, "Local businessman establishes scholarship fund in memory of war bride wife." The article was brief, but it mentioned Harold Whitmore, David's grandfather, establishing a scholarship at the local college in memory of his beloved wife Ingrid, who fled Nazi persecution in Austria before their marriage in 1943. The article included a grainy photo of Harold and a young woman who might have been Ingrid, though the image quality made it impossible to be certain. Sarah's pulse quickened. David had mentioned his grandmother was from Europe, but he'd always been vague about the details. When pressed, he'd said something about his family not talking much about the old country, that his grandmother had wanted to focus on building a new life in America rather than dwelling on what she had left behind. But what if there was more to the story? Sarah spent the next 2 hours falling down research rabbit holes, cross-referencing dates and names, following digital breadcrumbs that led nowhere and everywhere at once. She learned that Harold Whitmore had been moderately successful in commercial real estate, that he'd married Ingrid Schneider in a small ceremony at St. Mary's Cathedral, that they had one son, David's father, William, in 1947. What she couldn't find was much information about Ingrid herself. Immigration records from that era were spotty, especially for refugees, and the few documents Sarah could access had been heavily redacted. But one detail kept appearing. Ingrid had arrived in New York in early 1943 with personal effects of significant value, according to a customs form Sarah found buried in an Ellis Island database. Personal effects, like jewelry that might need to be hidden from Nazi confiscation. Sarah's Chinese food had gone cold hours ago, but she barely noticed. She was deep in the zone that her students recognized, the same focused intensity she brought to lesson planning or grading papers when she was chasing down exactly the right way to explain a complex concept. This felt important in a way she couldn't yet articulate, like she was solving a puzzle that had been waiting decades for someone to notice the missing pieces. Her phone rang, jolting her out of concentration. The caller ID showed her best friend Meredith's name, along with a photo from last year's wine tasting that felt like it belonged to a different lifetime. "Don't tell me you're sitting alone in that apartment again," Meredith said without preamble. "It's Thursday night. Live people do things on Thursday nights." "I'm researching," Sarah said, minimizing browser windows even though Meredith couldn't see them. "Researching what? New ways to torture yourself?" Sarah hesitated. David had been Meredith's friend first, someone he'd met in college who'd become part of their coupled social circle. Since the accident, their friendship had become complicated by grief and guilt and the awkward mathematics of who got which friends in a tragedy. "David's family wants the engagement ring back," Sarah said finally. The silence on the other end stretched long enough that Sarah wondered if the call had dropped. "They what now?" Sarah explained Margaret's visit, the ultimatum, Jessica's upcoming engagement. As she talked, her anger returned, not the desperate fury she'd felt in the lawyer's office, but something colder and more determined. "That's sick," Meredith said when Sarah finished. "I mean, genuinely twisted. You can't just give them David's ring." "It's not really David's ring, though. It's a family heirloom. Maybe they have a point." "Sarah, stop. You're not thinking clearly. David gave you that ring because he wanted to marry you, because he loved you. His family doesn't get to take that away just because he's dead. Because his mother is a controlling narcissist who never thought you were good enough for her precious son." Meredith had never particularly liked Margaret Whitmore, a feeling that was enthusiastically mutual. At David and Sarah's engagement party, Margaret had made several pointed comments about Sarah's modest background and quaint little teaching job, always delivered with a smile sharp enough to cut glass. "But maybe she's right, though," Sarah said. "Maybe I'm not good enough. Maybe if I'd been a better fiancé, if I'd picked David up at night instead of letting him drive home alone." "Sarah Elizabeth Chen, if you blame yourself for that accident one more time, I'm driving over there to shake some sense into you. A drunk driver ran a red light? That's not your fault, and it's not David's fault, and it's sure as hell not something Margaret Whitmore gets to use against you." Meredith's voice softened. "Honey, what's this really about? Because I know you, and I know you don't give up this easily. What aren't you telling me?" Sarah looked at her laptop screen, still open to the 1962 newspaper article. "I think there might be more to the ring's history than anyone realizes. David's grandmother, there might be something important about where she came from, what she brought with her." "Important how?" "I don't know yet, but I'm going to find out." After Meredith hung up with promises to help however she could, Sarah returned to her research with renewed focus. She created a timeline on a legal pad, mapping out everything she knew about the Whitmore family history. Harold and Ingrid's marriage in 1943, William's birth in 1947, Ingrid's death in 1961, followed by Harold's scholarship announcement, David's birth in 1985, his father, William's, death from cancer in 2010 when David was still in graduate school. The gaps in the timeline bothered her. What had happened to Ingrid's personal effects of significant value? Why was Margaret so desperate to get the ring back specifically when she could afford to buy Jessica any jewelry she wanted? And why now, when David had been dead for 6 months? Unless Margaret knew something about the ring's value that she hadn't shared, something that made it worth more than sentimental attachment. Sarah picked up her phone and dialed Directory Assistance, feeling simultaneously foolish and determined. "Portland, Oregon," she told the automated system. "Elena Rodriguez, jewelry appraiser." 20 minutes later, she had an appointment for the next morning at 10 a.m. The consultation would cost $250, money she didn't really have, but money that might buy her answers worth more than the expense. As she finally headed to bed, Sarah caught her reflection in the bathroom mirror. For the first time in months, her eyes held something other than grief. They held purpose and the beginning of hope, and the dangerous glimmer of someone who was tired of being underestimated. She twisted the ring on her finger, feeling the small ridges of those mysterious engravings against her skin. Tomorrow, she would start getting answers. Tonight, she would dream of David and trust that he would understand why she couldn't simply surrender the symbol of their love without a fight. In her dreams, David sat beside her on their old couch, sketching architectural plans for a house that would never be built. But when Sarah looked at the papers in his hands, they weren't floor plans at all. They were maps, leading to secrets buried deeper than foundations, worth more than the sum of their parts. "Find the truth," Dream David whispered. "Find what they don't want you to know." Sarah awoke with those words echoing in her mind and sunlight streaming through curtains that David had helped her hang. Outside her window, the city was waking up. Coffee shops opening, commuters starting their daily migrations, the ordinary business of living continuing its relentless forward motion. But inside her small apartment, time felt suspended between past and future, between grief and possibility, between the woman she'd been and the woman she might still become. The ring caught morning light and threw it across the ceiling in patterns that shifted like kaleidoscope fragments, beautiful and temporary and full of hidden meaning. Elena Rodriguez's jewelry shop occupied a narrow storefront squeezed between a used bookstore and a Vietnamese restaurant, the kind of place that looked modest from the outside but held treasures within. Sarah had arrived 15 minutes early, her nerves jumping like live wires, the engagement ring heavy in her jacket pocket wrapped in tissue paper. The interior smelled of metal polish and old wood, display cases lined with estate jewelry that caught light from carefully positioned lamps. Elena herself was a woman in her 50s with silver-streaked hair pulled back in a practical bun and reading glasses that hung from a beaded chain around her neck. Her handshake was firm, her manner professional but warm. "You mentioned on the phone this was an engagement ring with possible historical significance?" Elena said, leading Sarah to a workstation equipped with magnifying equipment and precise measuring tools. "May I see it?" Sarah unwrapped the ring with trembling fingers, placing it carefully on the black velvet cloth Elena had spread across the desk. Under the bright examination light,
Every facet of the diamond seemed to come alive, casting tiny rainbows across the surrounding darkness. Elena's expression changed immediately. She reached for her magnifying glass, studying the ring with the focused intensity of an expert who had just encountered something unexpected. "This is remarkable," she murmured, turning the ring to examine it from different angles. "The craftsmanship is European, definitely. I'd say Austrian or German, 1920s or early 1930s, but the setting—" She paused, reaching for a more powerful magnifying device. "There are markings here. Very small, very precise. They look like hallmarks, but not standard jewelry hallmarks." Sarah leaned forward. "What kind of markings?" "I need to photograph these under magnification. It may take some time to research what they mean." Elena looked up, her eyes sharp with professional curiosity. "Where did this ring come from? I mean, what do you know about its provenance?" Sarah told her what little she knew: Ingrid's arrival from Austria in 1943, the family's reluctance to discuss the past, Margaret's urgent demand for the ring's return. As she spoke, Elena's expression grew increasingly thoughtful. "I want to run some tests. X-ray fluorescence to determine the exact composition of the metals, microscopic analysis of the diamond itself, research into these markings, but I have to ask, are you prepared for what we might find?" "What do you mean?" Elena set down her magnifying glass and met Sarah's eyes directly. During World War II, many Jewish families fleeing Nazi persecution brought whatever valuables they could carry. Sometimes those valuables were more valuable than they appeared. Hidden compartments, coded information, even documentation of assets left behind. If this ring belonged to a refugee from that period? The implication hung between them like smoke. Sarah thought of her research the night before, of Ingrid Schneider arriving in New York with personal effects of significant value, and Harold Whitmore's surprising financial success in the post-war years. How long would a complete analysis take? 3 days, maybe 4. I'll need to send some tests to a specialist I work with at the university. It won't be cheap, probably $800 for everything. Sarah's heart sank. $800 might as well have been $8,000 on her teacher's salary. She started to reach for the ring, but Elena stopped her with a gentle touch. "However," Elena continued, "if this ring turns out to have the kind of historical significance I suspect it might, there are collectors and museums who would pay substantial fees just for documentation. If you're willing to split any authentication fees or research payments, I'd be willing to front the costs." Sarah stared at the ring, its diamond faces reflecting the overhead lights like tiny mirrors. "You really think it's that important?" "I think your family wants it back very badly. And in my experience, people don't fight that hard for something unless they know exactly what they're fighting for." 2 hours later, Sarah walked out of Elena's shop with a receipt and a promise that Elena would call as soon as she had preliminary results. The ring remained behind, locked in Elena's safe, the first time Sarah had been separated from it since David's death. Her finger felt naked, the pale band of skin where the ring had rested standing out like an accusation. She was halfway to her car when her phone rang. Margaret Whitmore's name appeared on the screen, and Sarah's stomach dropped. "Sarah, I hope you've come to your senses about our conversation yesterday. Jessica's engagement party is tomorrow evening, and she'll need the ring."
"I am still considering my options," Sarah replied, unlocking her car with hands that shook slightly. "Your options?" Margaret's laugh was sharp as breaking glass. "What options could you possibly have? You're a public school teacher living in a rented apartment. Do you really think you can fight the Whitmore family legal team?" Sarah settled behind the steering wheel, drawing strength from the familiar confines of her small Honda. "Maybe I can't fight your lawyers, Margaret, but I can make sure the truth comes out." The silence on the other end stretched long enough that Sarah wondered if Margaret had hung up. When she finally spoke, her voice had changed. Still authoritative, but with an undercurrent of something that might have been fear. What truth could you possibly know that would matter to anyone? I don't know yet, Sarah admitted, but I'm learning. I'm learning about Ingrid, about where she came from, about what she brought with her when she fled Europe. I'm learning about Austrian refugees and family treasures, and the kinds of secrets that people keep for decades. You're talking nonsense. Ingrid was David's grandmother, nothing more. That ring has no significance beyond its sentimental value to our family. Then why are you so afraid of me having it appraised? Another long pause. Sarah could almost hear Margaret's thoughts racing, calculating risks and potential damage. You're grieving, Margaret said finally, her tone shifting to something that might have passed for sympathy if it hadn't been so obviously manufactured. I understand that losing David has been difficult, but digging into ancient family history won't bring him back, Sarah. It will only cause pain for everyone involved. Whose pain are you really worried about, Margaret? Give me the ring, Sarah. Tonight. I'll have my driver pick it up from your apartment. No more games, no more delays. Jessica's happiness shouldn't be held hostage by your inability to move forward. The accusation hit like a physical blow. Sarah gripped the steering wheel until her knuckles went white, fighting back tears that were part grief, part rage, part stubborn determination. The ring isn't at my apartment. Where is it? Somewhere safe? Somewhere you can't just take it. Margaret's composure finally cracked. You little fool! Do you have any idea what you're meddling with? Do you think this is some romantic mystery where the plucky school teacher uncovers family secrets and gets a happy ending? This is real life, Sarah. Real consequences, real people who can make your life very difficult. Is that a threat? It's a promise. I tried to be reasonable, but you've made that impossible. Have the ring at my house by 6 o'clock tonight, or you'll discover exactly how difficult life can become for someone who crosses the Whitmore family. The line went dead. Sarah sat in her car outside Elena's shop, her hands shaking as she processed what had just happened. Margaret's mask had finally fallen away, revealing something desperate and dangerous underneath. Whatever secret the ring held, Margaret was willing to threaten and intimidate to protect it. Sarah's phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. Miss Chen, this is Principal Martinez. We need to discuss some concerns that have been brought to my attention regarding your performance. Please see me first thing Monday morning.
The message felt like ice water in her veins. Sarah had taught at Jefferson Middle School for 4 years, had received nothing but positive evaluations, had never had a single disciplinary action in her file. The timing couldn't be coincidental. Another text arrived 30 seconds later, this one from her landlord. Sarah, I hate to do this, but I've received complaints about noise and visitors at odd hours. We may need to discuss your lease situation. Can you call me? Then another, from her car insurance company. We're reviewing your policy following a complaint about your driving record. Please contact our office immediately. Sarah stared at the messages, understanding dawning like a cold sunrise. This was what Margaret had meant by real consequences. The Whitmore family's influence extended further than Sarah had imagined, into school boards and city councils, into business relationships and social networks. They were systematically attacking every aspect of her life, using their connections to create problems that could destroy her stability and reputation. Her phone rang again. This time, it was Meredith, her voice tight with worry. Sarah, something weird is happening. I just got a call from Jessica Whitmore, David's sister. She wanted to know if I'd seen you lately, if you seemed unstable or obsessed with David's death. She said the family was concerned about your mental health. Sarah closed her eyes. They're trying to discredit me, make me look crazy so no one will believe whatever I find out about the ring. What ring? Sarah, you're scaring me. What's going on? Sarah explained about the appraisal, Elena's suspicions, and Margaret's escalating threats. As she talked, she could feel Meredith's alarm growing. You need to be careful, Meredith said when Sarah finished. "The Whitmores have serious money, serious connections. If they're willing to go this far to get that ring back, then it's worth more than anyone realizes. Meredith, what if David's grandmother brought something out of Austria that was incredibly valuable? What if the Whitmore family fortune isn't what everyone thinks it is? Then you're playing with fire. Sarah, maybe you should just give them the ring. It's not worth risking your career, your home, everything you've worked for." But even as Meredith spoke, Sarah felt her resolve hardening. David had been a man who believed in doing the right thing, even when it was difficult. He'd worked on low-income housing projects because he thought architecture should serve communities, not just wealthy clients. He'd chosen to propose with his grandmother's ring instead of buying something flashy because he valued history and meaning over status. If the ring held secrets that the Whitmore family had been hiding for 70 years, if those secrets had anything to do with money stolen from Holocaust victims or refugee families, then David would have wanted the truth to come out. He wouldn't have wanted his memory tainted by blood money or stolen heritage. "I can't give up now," Sarah told Meredith. "Not when I'm this close to understanding what they're so afraid of." "What if you're wrong? What if the ring is just a ring and you're destroying your life over nothing?" Sarah thought of Elena's excitement, of the mysterious markings hidden in the platinum band, and Margaret's increasingly desperate attempts to get the ring back. "Then I'll have to live with the consequences. But I'll know I tried to honor David's memory the right way." After hanging up with Meredith, Sarah sat in her car and made a list of everyone she needed to call. Her principal to address the mysterious complaints, her landlord to defend against whatever allegations had been made, her insurance company to dispute whatever false claims were being processed. Each call would be a battle, each explanation an opportunity for doubt to creep in. But she would fight each battle because the alternative was surrender. And surrendering meant accepting that might made right, that people with money and influence could rewrite history to suit their needs. It meant accepting that David's love for her, symbolized by the ring he'd placed on her finger, was less important than his family's desire to control their narrative. As Sarah started her car and pulled into traffic, she caught a glimpse of herself in the rearview mirror. The woman looking back at her was different from the one who had worn David's ring without questioning its history. This woman had lines around her eyes and a set to her jaw that spoke of determination born from loss. This woman had been pushed too far and was finally pushing back. The battle for the truth was just beginning, and Sarah Chen was no longer the grieving school teacher who could be easily intimidated or dismissed. She was becoming something more dangerous, a woman with nothing left to lose and everything to fight for. The call from Elena came at 6:47 a.m. on Friday morning, 3 days after Sarah had left the ring at the jewelry shop. Sarah had been lying awake for hours, staring at the ceiling and listening to the sounds of her neighbors beginning their day when her phone buzzed against the nightstand. "Sarah, you need to come in immediately." Elena's voice was tight with excitement and something that might have been fear. "What I found, it changes everything. How quickly can you get here?" 40 minutes later, Sarah sat across from Elena in the small office behind the jewelry shop, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had gone cold while she absorbed what Elena was showing her. "The markings aren't hallmarks," Elena said, pointing to enlarged photographs displayed on her computer screen. "They're coordinates, latitude and longitude, engraved in a code that took my colleague at the university 2 days to crack. But that's not the most remarkable thing." Elena clicked to another image, this one showing the ring under X-ray. Sarah gasped. Hidden within the platinum band, invisible to the naked eye, was a small compartment that appeared as a dark hollow in the radiographic image. "There's something inside," Elena continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "Something that's been sealed in there for decades, but opening it would damage the ring, possibly destroy whatever's hidden. Before we go any further, you need to understand what we might be dealing with." Elena turned to face Sarah directly, her expression grave. I've spent the last 3 days researching Austrian Jewish families who fled to America in the early 1940s. Ingrid Snyder wasn't just any refugee, Sarah. She was the daughter of Heinrich Snyder, one of Vienna's most prominent Jewish bankers. The Schneider family owned significant property and financial assets before the Nazi Anschluss in 1938. Sarah's coffee cup trembled in her hands. What happened to them? Heinrich was murdered in Kristallnacht in November 1938. His wife died in Dachau in 1942. Ingrid was the only family member who escaped, arriving in New York in February 1943 with papers declaring her personal effects included jewelry valued at over $50,000, equivalent to about $700,000 today. The number swam in Sarah's vision. $700,000? That's just what she declared to customs. Families fleeing Nazi persecution often hid their most valuable assets in ways that wouldn't be detected. Hollow jewelry, false compartments, coded information that could help them recover hidden wealth or prove ownership of confiscated property. Alanda clicked to another screen, showing a scanned document in German with official-looking stamps and signatures. This is a property deed I found in the Austrian National Archives. Heinrich Schneider owned 3 buildings in central Vienna, plus shares in several businesses. The deed lists Ingrid as the sole heir.
But she fled to America and married David's grandfather. Yes, and here's where things get interesting. Harold Whitmore was a minor real estate agent in 1943. Moderate income, small savings. But by 1950, he was buying commercial properties throughout the city. By 1960, he owned half a dozen buildings and had established multiple business partnerships. The timeline suggests his financial success began immediately after his marriage to Ingrid. Sarah set down her coffee cup, her mind racing. You think Ingrid had access to hidden wealth from her family's assets in Vienna? I think this ring contains information that could prove ownership of property worth millions in today's market. Property that was confiscated by the Nazis and never returned to the rightful owners. Property that might still exist, might still generate income, might still be claimable by Ingrid's descendants. The implications crashed over Sarah like a tide. David's family knows? Margaret Whitmore knows something, or she wouldn't be fighting this hard to get the ring back. But I doubt she knows everything. My guess is that Ingrid shared some family history with William, who passed enough information to Margaret to understand the ring's significance without revealing the full scope of what might be at stake. Elena pulled up another document, a legal filing from 1985, the year David was born. Harold Whitmore created a complex trust structure right before he died, with William as primary beneficiary, but Margaret as trust administrator. Interestingly, the trust includes provisions for assets of European origin that may be discovered or reclaimed in future years. Sarah stared at the screen. They've been planning for this. For decades, they've known there might be family wealth that could be recovered. And now David is dead, which means you, as his intended wife, could have legal standing to claim part of that inheritance, especially if you possess the key to proving ownership. The ring. The ring. Sarah, if what I suspect is true, you're not just holding an engagement ring, you're holding the key to reclaiming assets that could be worth tens of millions of dollars. Assets that rightfully belong to the surviving family of Holocaust victims. Sarah felt the world tilting around her. She thought of her small apartment, her teacher's salary, her secondhand car that needed new tires. She thought of Margaret Whitmore's expensive clothes and perfectly manicured nails, of Jessica's casual assumption that she deserved everything handed to her, of the Whitmore family's social standing built on charitable donations and community philanthropy. How much of their fortune came from Ingrid's family? Impossible to know without more investigation, but Harold's business records show several mysterious cash infusions in the 1940s and 50s, always from European business partners who are never named or identified.
The pattern suggests he had access to hidden wealth that he slowly converted into legitimate American assets. Elena's phone rang, interrupting the conversation. She glanced at the caller ID and frowned. It's my insurance company. Third time they've called this week about reviewing my business policy. She declined the call and looked back at Sarah. Have you been getting unusual calls lately? Problems with various services or accounts? How did you know? Because powerful families don't like having their secrets exposed, and they have ways of creating pressure. But Sarah, what we've discovered here is bigger than the Whitmore family's reputation. If Ingrid's assets were never properly claimed or returned, there could be other families affected, other victims whose property was stolen and never restored to the rightful owners. Sarah's phone buzzed with yet another text message. This one was from her school district's HR department, requesting a meeting about concerns regarding professional conduct. The systematic campaign against her was escalating, but now she understood why. What do we do now?
Elena was quiet for a long moment, studying the X-ray image of the ring. We have 3 choices. First, we could open the hidden compartment and see what's inside, but that might damage both the evidence and the ring itself. Second, we could take what we've learned to a lawyer who specializes in Holocaust restitution cases. There are attorneys who do nothing but track down stolen assets and return them to rightful owners. Third, we could give the ring back to Margaret and pretend this never happened. Yes, and hope that your life goes back to normal. Sarah thought of David, of the man who had chosen architecture because he wanted to build things that would help communities, who had worked late on affordable housing projects, who had believed that doing the right thing was more important than doing the easy thing. David wouldn't want me to give up. He wouldn't want his family's fortune built on stolen property from Holocaust victims. Sarah met Elena's eyes. I want to open the compartment. Elena nodded slowly. I hoped you'd say that, but I need you to understand the risks. Once we open it, there's no going back. Whatever we find becomes evidence, becomes part of a larger story that could affect many people. The Whitmore family will fight harder than you can imagine to keep this buried. Then we'd better document everything we find. Elena set up a microscope camera while Sarah signed release forms acknowledging the risks to the ring. As Elena prepared her tools, precision instruments that looked more like surgical equipment than jewelry repair tools, Sarah's phone rang. It was Margaret Whitmore. Sarah, I'm calling one last time to offer you a reasonable solution. Margaret's voice was clipped, professional, but Sarah could hear the strain underneath. Jessica's engagement party is tonight. Return the ring by 5 o'clock, and all of these unfortunate misunderstandings about your job and your living situation will resolve themselves. What misunderstandings? The complaints about your teaching performance, the concerns about your mental stability following David's death, the questions about whether you're fit to work with children. These things have a way of following people, Sarah, staining reputations permanently. Sarah watched Elena position the ring under high-powered magnification. And if I don't give you the ring, then Monday morning will be very unpleasant for you, and Tuesday will be worse, and it will continue to get worse until you realize that some battles aren't worth fighting. Margaret, did you ever wonder what happened to Ingrid's family in Vienna? Did you ever ask about the property they owned, the assets they lost when the Nazis took power? The silence stretched so long that Sarah thought the call had dropped. When Margaret spoke again, her voice had changed completely, flat, dangerous, stripped of all pretense. Stay away from things that don't concern you, Sarah. There are consequences for people who dig where they shouldn't. Consequences for who? For me or for you when people learn how the Whitmore fortune was really built? The line went dead. Elena looked up from her microscope setup, her face pale. She knows we're getting close to something important, Elena said. Then we'd better find it before she finds a way to stop us. Elena positioned her precision tools at the ring's hidden seam, the place where X-rays had revealed the secret compartment. This will take time and steady hands. Are you ready?
Sarah nodded, her heart hammering against her ribs. Outside, the morning city moved at its normal pace, Commuters heading to work, school buses picking up children, the ordinary rhythm of life continuing unchanged. But in the small jewelry shop, surrounded by the tools of a careful craftsman and the weight of 70-year-old secrets, everything was about to change. "Do it," Sarah said. Elena made the first careful incision into the platinum band, following the nearly invisible seam that had hidden its secret for 7 decades. As the metal parted under her precise tools, Sarah held her breath and waited for history to reveal itself. The hidden compartment was no larger than a pencil eraser, but what it contained would rewrite everything Sarah thought she knew about David's family, about justice, and about the price of keeping buried truths buried. The tiny scroll of paper that emerged from the ring's hidden compartment was no bigger than a fortune from a Chinese cookie, but Elena handled it with the reverence reserved for ancient manuscripts. Under the magnifying glass, the paper appeared to be silk rather than traditional paper, with writing so small it was barely visible even under magnification. "It's in German," Elena murmured, photographing the document from multiple angles before attempting to unfold it completely. And what appears to be numbers. Lots of numbers. Sarah leaned closer, squinting at the cramped handwriting that covered both sides of the silk paper. "Can you translate it?" "My German is rusty, but..." Elena pulled up a translation app on her phone, typing in words as she deciphered them. "It appears to be a list of properties. Addresses in Vienna, Berlin, Munich, and these numbers, they look like account numbers for Swiss banks." As Elena worked through the translation, a picture began to emerge. The document was a comprehensive record of the Schneider family's assets, real estate holdings, business partnerships, bank accounts, even art collections and jewelry. But more than just a list, it was a roadmap for recovery, complete with legal document numbers, witness names, and detailed descriptions that would allow someone to prove ownership decades later. "Ingrid was brilliant," Elena said softly. "She didn't just escape with jewelry. She escaped with a complete financial blueprint that would allow her family's assets to be recovered when it became safe to do so." Sarah stared at the list, understanding dawning. "But it was never safe, was it? Not for her. She came to America as a refugee with nothing, married Harold, started a new life. Going back to claim Nazi-confiscated property would have been dangerous, maybe impossible. And expensive. The legal battles would have taken years, cost enormous amounts in attorney fees, with no guarantee of success. Much easier to use the assets she did recover, probably jewelry and cash she converted gradually, to build a new fortune in America." Elena's computer chimed with an email notification. Her contact at the university had sent additional research, including historical records from Swiss banks and Austrian property registries. As Elena opened the files, her expression grew increasingly serious. "Sarah, according to these records, most of the properties listed on Ingrid's document still exist. Some are still generating rental income that's been held in escrow for decades, waiting for rightful claimants. The bank accounts, 3 of them were never claimed and have been earning interest for 70 years. How much money are we talking about?" Elena was quiet for a long time, cross-referencing numbers and calculating compound interest. When she finally looked up, her face was pale. Conservatively, accounting for property appreciation, unclaimed rental income, and bank account interest over 70 years, somewhere between $40 and $60 million. Sarah felt the room spin around her. She gripped the edge of Elena's desk, fighting waves of dizziness as the implications crashed over her like a tsunami. "The Whitmore family has been living off stolen Holocaust assets for 70 years.
Not stolen, exactly. Ingrid was the rightful heir, and she had every right to use whatever resources she could recover to build a new life. But, Elena gestured at the document, she clearly intended for the full extent of her family's assets to be recovered eventually.
This document is too detailed, too carefully preserved to be just a memoir. It's evidence, prepared for a future legal claim. Sarah's phone had been buzzing steadily with notifications, more mysterious complaints about her job performance, more problems with her insurance, more pressure from the systematic campaign Margaret had launched to destroy her stability. But now, looking at the evidence spread across Elena's desk, Sarah felt something shift inside her. The fear that had been eating at her for days crystallized into cold, determined anger. They've been fighting so hard to get this ring back because they know what it contains. They know their entire fortune is built on assets that should have been properly claimed and possibly shared with other Holocaust survivors. Elena nodded. And with David dead, you're the only person outside the family who has access to the evidence, the only one who could expose what they've been hiding. What happens now? Elena was already reaching for her phone. Now we call someone who specializes in these kinds of cases. I know an attorney in New York who spent his career tracking down Nazi-looted assets and returning them to rightful owners. If anyone can help navigate this situation, it's him. 3 hours later, Sarah sat in Elena's office on a conference call with attorney David Goldstein, whose firm had recovered over $200 million in stolen assets for Holocaust survivors and their families. His voice carried the weight of someone who had seen similar cases many times before. "What you've found is extraordinarily significant," Goldstein said after Elena had walked him through their discoveries. "The documentation is more complete than anything I've seen in 20 years of this work. But I need to be clear about what you're facing." "The Whitmore family won't give up without a fight," Sarah said. "It's more than that. You're talking about dismantling a family fortune that's been established for 3 generations. The legal battles will be extensive, expensive, and brutal. They'll attack your credibility, your mental health, your right to make any claim at all. And that's before we even get to the international legal complexities of recovering assets from multiple countries." Sarah thought of the messages piling up on her phone, the systematic campaign already underway to destroy her reputation and livelihood. But now, looking at the evidence spread across Elena's desk, Sarah felt something shift inside her. The fear that had been eating at her for days crystallized into cold, determined anger. They've been fighting so hard to get this ring back because they know what it contains. They know their entire fortune is built on assets that should have been properly claimed and possibly shared with other Holocaust survivors. Elena nodded. "And with David dead, you're the only person outside the family who has access to the evidence, the only one who could expose what they've been hiding. What happens now?" Elena was already reaching for her phone. "Now we call someone who specializes in these kinds of cases. I know an attorney in New York who spent his career tracking down Nazi-looted assets and returning them to rightful owners. If anyone can help navigate this situation, it's him." 3 hours later, Sarah sat in Elena's office on a conference call with attorney David Goldstein, whose firm had recovered over $200 million in stolen assets for Holocaust survivors and their families. His voice carried the weight of someone who had seen similar cases many times before. "What you found is extraordinarily significant," Goldstein said after Elena had walked him through their discoveries. "The documentation is more complete than anything I've seen in 20 years of this work. But I need to be clear about what you're facing. The Whitmore family won't give up without a fight," Sarah said. "It's more than that. You're talking about dismantling a family fortune that's been established for 3 generations. The legal battles will be extensive, expensive, and brutal. They'll attack your credibility, your mental health, your right to make any claim at all. And that's before we even get to the international legal complexities of recovering assets from multiple countries." Sarah thought of the messages piling up on her phone, the systematic campaign already underway to destroy her reputation and livelihood. But now, looking at the evidence spread across Elena's desk, Sarah felt something shift inside her. The fear that had been eating at her for days crystallized into cold, determined anger. They've been fighting so hard to get this ring back because they know what it contains.
They know their entire fortune is built on assets that should have been properly claimed and possibly shared with other Holocaust survivors. Elena nodded. And with David dead, you're the only person outside the family who has access to the evidence, the only one who could expose what they've been hiding. What happens now?
Then we'll need to move quickly, Goldstein said. Once the Whitmore family realizes you have legal representation, they'll escalate their efforts to discredit you and hide assets. We'll need to file preliminary injunctions to prevent them from moving money or selling properties, and we'll need to document everything they've been doing to intimidate you. The next week passed in a blur of legal documents, depositions, and media attention that Sarah hadn't expected. Goldstein's decision to file public records requests for the Whitmore family's financial history triggered automatic notifications to several watchdog organizations that tracked Nazi-looted assets. Within days, the story had been picked up by the local news, then national outlets, then international media focused on Holocaust restitution efforts. Sarah found herself at the center of a storm she hadn't anticipated. Reporters called her apartment constantly. Her school principal, suddenly supportive once the story broke, offered her a leave of absence to deal with the legal proceedings. Margaret Whitmore, through her attorneys, released statements characterizing Sarah as an unstable gold digger trying to profit from tragedy. But other voices emerged as well. Holocaust survivors and their families who had been fighting similar battles for decades reached out with support and encouragement. Legal experts praised the quality of documentation Ingrid had preserved. Historians noted the case as an important example of how Nazi asset theft continued to affect families generations later. The most surprising call came from Thomas Ashworth, Jessica Whitmore's fiancé. He contacted Sarah directly, his voice shaking with what sounded like relief. "I need you to know that Jessica and I have broken our engagement," he said. "When this story came out, when I learned about how the Whitmore family fortune was really built, I couldn't be part of it. My grandfather survived the Warsaw Ghetto. I can't marry into a family that's been living off stolen Holocaust assets." Jessica's engagement party had been canceled. The society pages that were supposed to announce her upcoming marriage instead ran stories about the legal battle consuming her family. Margaret's carefully constructed social standing began to crumble as friends and business associates distanced themselves from the growing scandal. But other voices emerged as well. Holocaust survivors and their families, who had been fighting similar battles for decades, reached out with support and encouragement. Legal experts praised the quality of documentation Ingrid had preserved. Historians noted the case as an important example of how Nazi asset theft continued to affect families generations later. The most surprising call came 6 weeks after Elena first opened the ring's hidden compartment. Goldstein called Sarah with news that changed everything. "We've been in contact with the Austrian government and several international organizations that track Nazi-looted assets. Based on Ingrid's documentation, we've been able to identify 17 other Jewish families whose property was confiscated along with the Schneiders. Some of these families have living descendants who never knew their grandparents had owned valuable real estate in Europe." Sarah sat in her apartment, looking out at the city where David had planned to build affordable housing, where he had dreamed of making a difference in people's lives. What does that mean for them? It means we can help them recover millions of dollars in assets that rightfully belong to them, property that's been generating income for decades, while the rightful owners lived in poverty or struggled to rebuild their lives after the war. "Sarah, because you refuse to give up that ring, we're going to be able to return stolen wealth to Holocaust survivors and their children." The legal settlement that eventually emerged was complex, involving courts in 3 countries and negotiations that took 8 months to complete. The Whitmore family agreed to return a significant portion of their assets to the newly established Schneider Holocaust Restitution Fund, which would distribute recovered wealth to affected families and fund educational programs about Holocaust remembrance and refugee assistance. Sarah's portion of the settlement was substantial, enough to quit teaching and focus full-time on administrating the restitution fund.
but she chose to remain in her classroom while serving on the fund's board of directors. The work felt like a continuation of David's dreams, using resources to help communities and families who needed advocates. Margaret Whitmore never spoke to Sarah again, but Jessica surprised everyone by reaching out months after the settlement was finalized. She had moved to Seattle, taken a job with a nonprofit that helped refugees resettle in America, and seemed genuinely committed to atoning for her family's decades of secrets.
I grew up thinking I deserved everything because of our family name, Jessica told Sarah during their phone conversation. Learning the truth about where our money came from, it changed everything about how I see the world. I want to spend the rest of my life helping people who are in the situation my great-great-grandmother was in, fleeing persecution with nothing but what they can carry. 3 years later, Sarah stood in the Vienna cemetery where Heinrich and Maria Schneider had been buried in a small plot marked only with numbers, their names erased by Nazi bureaucrats who had methodically attempted to erase Jewish identity from Austrian records. Now, a proper headstone bore their names in both German and Hebrew, paid for by the restitution fund and erected by descendants they never knew had survived. Beside her, Elena Rodriguez placed a small bouquet of white roses at the base of the memorial. They had traveled to Austria together as part of the fund's work to document recovered properties and ensure proper commemoration of the families whose assets had been stolen and finally returned. Ingrid would have been proud, Elena said softly, knowing that her parents' names are finally restored, that their property has been returned to help other Holocaust survivors. Sarah touched the simple gold band on her ring finger, not David's grandmother's engagement ring, which now resided in a museum display about Holocaust restitution, but a new ring she had chosen for herself, a symbol of the woman she had become rather than the woman she had been. The cemetery was quiet in the early morning light, with ancient trees casting long shadows across headstones that told stories of lives interrupted, families destroyed, dreams deferred but not forgotten. Sarah had learned to find peace in these places, understanding that grief was not something to be overcome, but something to be transformed into purpose. Her phone buzzed with a message from her current assistant at the restitution fund. Another family had been located, descendants of a watchmaker whose shop had been confiscated in 1938, whose tools and inventory had been sold to benefit the Reich. The family had been living in Brazil for 3 generations, never knowing their grandfather had owned property in Vienna that was still generating rental income 7 decades later. Each case felt like a small miracle, like David's ring revealing its secrets all over again. Sarah had learned that justice was not a destination, but a practice, something that required constant vigilance and the willingness to fight battles that might take decades to resolve. 5 years later, the community center in Portland's Jade District bore a small plaque near its entrance. David Michael Whitmore Memorial Building, dedicated to the principle that home is something we build together. Sarah read the inscription every time she visited, which was often since the center hosted the weekly meetings of the Holocaust Education and Refugee Support Alliance that had grown from the original restitution fund. Inside, the meeting room buzzed with conversation in multiple languages. Holocaust survivors shared stories with newly arrived refugees from Syria, Somalia, and Afghanistan. Translators moved between groups, facilitating connections that transcended geography and generation. The common thread was displacement, loss, and the hard-won understanding that survival sometimes meant starting over with nothing but determination and the help of people who understood what it meant to rebuild from ashes.
"The ring brought us all together," said Ruth Chen. Sarah had legally changed her name after the settlement, honoring both her Uncle Robert and her new understanding of identity as something created rather than inherited. But it's the work that keeps us together. Jessica Whitmore, now Jessica Anders, having taken her new husband's name after marrying a refugee resettlement worker she met through her volunteer work, looked up from the craft table where she was helping children make welcome cards for new arrivals. "I used to think family was about blood and history," Jessica said. "Now I understand it's about who you choose to help, who you choose to stand with when things get difficult." The two women had developed an unlikely friendship, bonded by their shared understanding of how secrets could poison families and how truth, however painful, was the only foundation for genuine healing. Jessica's transformation from entitled socialite to passionate advocate had been gradual but complete, and Sarah often marveled at how tragedy could reveal hidden strength in the most unexpected people. 7 years later, the university lecture hall was packed with students, professors, and community members who had come to hear Sarah speak about the hidden history of Holocaust restitution, how one ring revealed a network of stolen assets. She had never intended to become a public speaker, but the story of David's ring had become a touchstone for discussions about historical justice, family secrets, and the responsibility of inheritors to confront difficult truths. "When I first wore this ring," Sarah said, clicking to a slide showing the engagement ring in its original setting, "I thought it was simply a symbol of love and commitment. I had no idea it was also a time capsule carrying evidence of a family's destruction and one woman's determination to preserve the possibility of justice for future generations." In the audience, she spotted familiar faces. Elena Rodriguez, who had become a consultant for museums and restitution organizations worldwide, training other jewelers to identify potential evidence in estate jewelry. Uncle Robert, retired from law but still attending every talk Sarah gave, proud of his niece's transformation from grieving teacher to international advocate. Margaret Whitmore, surprisingly, sitting in the back row with the careful posture of someone still learning to carry shame and responsibility with dignity. After the settlement, Margaret had gradually acknowledged the truth about her family's fortune and had begun working with a therapist who specialized in helping families process inherited trauma and complicity. She would never be someone Sarah could call a friend, but she had become someone Sarah could respect for choosing the difficult path of accountability over denial. "The most important lesson I learned," Sarah continued, "is that inheritance is not just about money or property. We inherit stories, secrets, unresolved grief, and unfinished business. The question is, what do we choose to do with that inheritance? Do we perpetuate the silences and secrets, or do we have the courage to seek truth and make amends?" A student raised her hand. "What happened to your grief? I mean, you lost your fiancé, but then you discovered all this information about his family. Did it change how you remembered him?" Sarah paused, considering the question. It was one she'd been asked many times, and her answer had evolved over the years. "Grief doesn't disappear, but it can be transformed. When I learned the truth about David's ring, I also learned something important about David himself. He was a man who believed in building things that would help communities, who chose work that served people rather than just profit. If he had lived to learn what I discovered about his family's wealth, I believe he would have made the same choices I made. In fighting for justice for Holocaust survivors, I felt closer to David, not further away from him. I was honoring not just his memory, but his values." 10 years later, the wedding was small, held in the garden behind the community center that still bore David's name. Sarah's dress was simple, elegant, chosen for comfort rather than tradition. The man who stood beside her was Dr. Ahmad Hassan, a refugee from Syria whom she had met through the center's programs. He was a psychiatrist who specialized in trauma recovery, someone who understood the long journey from loss to healing because he had walked it himself after fleeing his homeland.
The ceremony was conducted in English and Arabic, with readings from Jewish, Christian, and Islamic traditions, a reflection of the community they had built together, where healing transcended religious and cultural boundaries. Elena served as Sarah's maid of honor, while Ahmad's brother, recently arrived from Jordan, stood as his best man. Margaret Whitmore attended, along with Jessica and her family. The years had softened the sharp edges of their relationship, replacing hostility with the careful respect of people who had learned to coexist with difficult truths. Margaret's presence was both surprising and meaningful, an acknowledgement that families could be redefined by choices rather than destroyed by revelations.
But the most moving moment came when Dr. Abraham Goldstein, now in his 90s and the unofficial patriarch of their refugee support community, performed the ring ceremony. Sarah wore a new ring, designed by Elena using stones donated by Holocaust survivors who had recovered family jewelry through the restitution fund. Each small diamond represented a life rebuilt, a family restored, a story honored rather than buried. "This ring carries the hopes of many families," Dr. Goldstein said, his voice still strong despite his age. "Not just the hope of your marriage, but the hope that justice delayed is not justice denied, that love can triumph over loss, that truth can emerge even from the deepest secrets." As Ahmed placed the ring on Sarah's finger, she thought of David, not with the sharp pain that had once accompanied his memory, but with gratitude for the path his love had set her on. The ring that had started as a symbol of one couple's commitment had become a catalyst for healing that had rippled out to touch hundreds of families across multiple continents. 15 years later, Sarah's office at the university overlooked the same park where David had proposed all those years ago. She was now a professor of social justice and Holocaust studies, teaching courses that examined how historical trauma affected contemporary communities and how individuals could work toward healing and restitution. On her desk sat a photograph from the previous year's conference of the International Coalition for Holocaust Restitution, representatives from 18 countries who had worked together to return over $800 million in stolen assets to survivors and their families. Sarah had been elected president of the coalition, a role that brought immense responsibility and the satisfaction of work that had expanded far beyond what she had imagined when she first walked into Elena's jewelry shop. Her students were diverse: traditional college-age learners, refugees working toward degrees while raising families, older adults returning to education after retirement. Many came from families with their own histories of displacement and loss, drawn to understand how individual stories connected to larger patterns of injustice and recovery. "Professor Chen," asked Maria, a young woman whose family had fled violence in El Salvador, "do you ever wonder what would have happened if you had just given the ring back when David's mother first asked for it?" Sarah considered the question, as she had many times over the years. "I think about parallel lives sometimes, the version where I handed over the ring and tried to move on with my grief. But I've learned that there are some losses that can only be healed by turning them into purpose. David's death would have been just a tragedy if I had kept his family's secrets buried. Instead, it became the beginning of work that has helped hundreds of families recover what was stolen from them." Another student, Hassan, whose family had fled Iraq during the war, raised his hand. "But was it worth it? All the legal battles, all the conflict with his family, all the years of fighting?" Sarah smiled, thinking of the dozens of families she had helped locate and recover stolen assets, the community center that continued to serve refugees from around the world, the scholarship fund that had sent refugee students to college, the memorial garden where Holocaust victims were remembered by name rather than just numbers. "Justice is not a cost-benefit analysis," she said. "It's a responsibility we inherit along with everything else our families pass down to us. When we have the power to right historical wrongs, even in small ways, we have an obligation to try. The alternative is to let injustice compound across generations, to let silence protect systems that have caused harm." As the class ended and students gathered their belongings, Sarah's phone chimed with a message from Elena, now retired but still consulting on difficult authentication cases. A family in Montreal had discovered what appeared to be a hidden compartment in their grandmother's jewelry, and they needed expert analysis to determine if it might contain evidence of assets lost during the Holocaust. Sarah smiled as she typed her response, offering to connect Elena with her network of international lawyers and researchers. After 15 years, each new case still felt like a puzzle waiting to be solved, a family waiting to be reunited with their history. 20 years later, Sarah stood before the newly unveiled memorial wall at the Vienna Museum of Jewish Heritage, her hair now streaked with silver, her hands weathered by decades of fighting for justice.
Engraved in black granite were the names of 847 families whose stolen assets had been recovered through the network that had grown from one hidden compartment in an engagement ring. Heinrich and Maria Schneider, she read aloud, her finger tracing their names among the hundreds of others. Ingrid Schneider Whitmore, and David Michael Whitmore, who never knew his grandmother's secret but would have been proud of where it led. Alema stood beside her, now using a walking stick, but still sharp-eyed and curious. "Do you ever regret not keeping the ring for yourself? It was meant to be yours, after all." Sarah smiled, thinking of the simple gold band she still wore, her wedding ring from Ahmad, who had passed peacefully 5 years earlier after a long battle with cancer. Their marriage had been built on shared purpose rather than shared grief, on building something together rather than clinging to what had been lost. "The ring was never really mine," Sarah said. "It belonged to history. My job was just to make sure history could finally tell its truth." Behind them, a group of school children listened as their teacher explained how one woman's refusal to give up an engagement ring had led to the recovery of hundreds of millions of dollars in stolen assets, how secrets kept for 70 years had finally been exposed, how justice could emerge from the most unlikely places. One young girl raised her hand. "What happened to the mean grandmother, the one who wanted to take the ring?" Sarah overheard the question and turned. Margaret Whitmore spent her last years working with refugee families, trying to make amends for the harm her silence had caused. She learned that it's never too late to choose truth over comfort, even when truth is more difficult. The teacher nodded. "Sometimes the most important lessons come from the hardest choices. Sometimes love means fighting for what's right, even when everyone tells you to give up." As the tour moved on, Sarah remained at the memorial wall, her reflection caught in the polished granite alongside the engraved names. She thought of David, of the proposal in Riverside Park, of the future they had planned together, that had become something entirely different but no less meaningful. Her phone buzzed with a message from the latest family they had helped locate, descendants of a clockmaker whose precision instruments had been confiscated in 1939. The family had just recovered not only their grandfather's shop, but the techniques and designs that had been preserved in Swiss archives for 80 years. Each recovery felt like David's ring opening again, revealing new secrets, connecting new families to their lost heritage. The work would continue long after Sarah was gone, carried forward by students who understood that justice was not a destination, but a practice, not a conclusion, but a commitment renewed every day.
The afternoon light caught the memorial wall and cast shadows that shifted like the pattern Sarah remembered from her engagement ring, beautiful and temporary and full of hidden meaning. She had learned to find David not in objects that could be lost or taken, but in the work that his love had inspired, in the families reunited with their history, in the young voices asking hard questions about how to build a more just world. Some stories end with weddings, others with revelations. This one ended with the understanding that love, real love, doesn't die with the beloved. It transforms into purpose that outlasts any individual life, creating ripples that spread across oceans and generations, touching families who will never know the name of the woman who refused to surrender an engagement ring, but whose lives were forever changed by her refusal to let secrets remain buried. Justice, Sarah had learned, was its own form of love letter, written not to one person, but to all the people whose stories deserve to be told, whose losses deserve to be acknowledged, whose dignity deserved to be restored. The ring had revealed its final secret, that true inheritance passes not through objects or money, but through the courage to confront difficult truths and transform them into healing that extends far beyond any single family's pain or any single person's grief. Stories like Sarah's reveal how individual courage can ripple outward to create changes that span generations. The ring that seemed like just a family heirloom held the key to reclaiming millions in stolen assets and reconnecting families with their lost heritage.